Alrighty, boys and girls, we're back. So when I left you off in video part 1, I had to break it up into two parts, which is probably for the better anyways, since it was getting a little long there. We had left off in part 1 where I had just finished applying the Windows image, which is the typical operation. That's the counterpart. This last command that you see right here. Why is it not? Excuse me. I'm used to things being a little bit set up a little bit differently. Alright, so this little highlighted part right here, that's the equivalent of using the DISM utility, which is, Microsoft's deployment, imaging, and servicing management utility for working with WIM files. So that operation is completed. We just applied the install WIM to the L drive, and what that did is, you should recognize that I have the L drive here opened up here. Oh, excuse me. This should look familiar. This should look like everybody's C drive. In fact, it is what most people's C drive should look like. And now we just dove into the Windows directory, and here you see System 32, etc. Right? Okay. So now that we've accomplished this, we need to set up the S drive to host boot files. In part 1, I kind of talked about the different considerations of the two system partitions that we need to take into consideration for a dual boot scenario. If you're using, if you're watching this for whatever reason to just see how a native boot VHD is set up, you're only going to have to worry about setting up the system partition once. But in a dual boot scenario, you have to work with a system partition for the native boot part and dual purpose, not dual boot. I meant to say dual purpose a second ago. So for a dual purpose native boot VHD and virtual machine VHD, when using the same VHD for native boot and in a virtual environment, you have to work with a system partition in the native boot environment, and then you have to worry about a system partition within the virtual environment. And I'll kind of dive into that. Actually, you know what? Since I have this opened up, here you see this S drive. We're gonna, for the intention of configuring this VHD for use in a virtual environment, we're gonna deploy the OS loader, aka the boot files, to this partition right here that I'm blipping on right there. So that's one system partition. It's not fully configured yet. That's why you don't see the system designation as we do right here. In the native boot environment, what we're going to do is use the boot manager and boot files that are already, the boot manager is hosted right here and is what BIOS is using to point to the OS loader, the bootloader, that's the files that are installed right here. And if I were to assign a drive letter to that, it would be accessible from Windows Explorer, and we could dive into that. And we basically see like the boot manager and the BCD store and whatnot. So in the native boot environment, the boot manager is pointing to a bootloader that points to the operating system files that are hosted right here on this C drive. And in the native boot scenario, what you do is configure an entry to point to the operating system files that are located on the VHD. So the bootloader would be on the system partition discrete external to the VHD, but once the VHD is mounted, like we have mounted here, the OS loader would point to system files hosted here. Make sense? All right. And then in a virtual environment, it would be looking for the OS loader, the bootloader files on this system partition. And that's because in a virtual environment, the guest doesn't have access to the external resources, like is the case that we see here on disk 0, right? So if this was loaded up in a virtual machine in Hyper-V or whatever, it wouldn't have access to these resources. Make sense? Hopefully it does. Hopefully it'll make sense when we kind of put it all together later. All right. So next thing we need to do, we need to bring up BCD boot. And we're going to do that right here. All right, give me a second. Give me just a second. Let me see if I can pause it. I don't know if this is still going. Let me just reference my notes here real quick. It's been about a week since I played with this, so I'm kind of going off the cuff here, and that's why it's probably a little incoherent. I apologize for that. I needed a little break from this, so the recency of this information isn't. When I was troubleshooting this, oh my god, I didn't even have to reference the walkthrough anymore. So, okay, we just applied the system image. So the next thing we need to do, alright, so this is where we're going to need to kind of have a little departure here. We need to discuss EFI versus BIOS. So in a dual boot scenario, we have the system's existing boot manager, right? So I just typed BCD edit over here, and that brought up the default BCD store for the host operating system. When you use BCD, you can point it to a different partitions installation. And remember what I'm saying here, because in an EFI, like in an EFI system, with EFI firmware, you don't have to assign a drive letter. But when you use BCD boot to install the boot files, you do have to assign a drive letter temporarily to the EFI system partition in order for BCD boot to work, because you have to specify a drive. That's the way BCD boot works. You specify the system files, and then you specify the installation location by boot drive, or excuse me, by drive letter. So remember that for EFI, if you're working with EFI, you temporarily do have to assign a drive letter to that EFI system partition for BCD boot to install the boot files. Once you install the boot files, you can disallocate or remove the drive letter. But with BIOS, you just leave the drive letter assigned because it's required. So what we're doing is we're looking at the default output of the BCD store. We have to work with GUIDs. If you're not familiar with that, it's a globally unique identifier. And this is like a GUID. I can't remember what really are the specific characteristics, but that's neither here nor there. So this is the GUID that identifies the bootloader for the existing, dual purpose native boot VHD that I got that's using Windows 7. So you can see that I've already gone through this, and with the host system being Windows Server 2012, if I were to type BCD edit enum default, here's the output. Now if I were to run the same command with the V, which stands for verbose option, that's what you just get used to using the verbose option. And the reason why I recommend that is because it's always going to output the GUID. So when you're working with the BCD store, you cannot accidentally modify something unwittingly, because you do have special identifiers like I used right here with default. They're well-known identifiers for BCD. You can work with those, but like I said, you can run into trouble if you mistakenly assign if you assign a different bootloader to the default than you think, then you might make some configuration changes to the default where you thought it was a different bootloader, if you know what I mean. So if we type BCD edit enum B, now we see all these different bootloader options. We see a bootloader for this. This is another well-known identifier, and what that means is the currently running operating system, which is what we see here, Server 2012. That's the bootloader that we're working with for the currently loaded operating system. Here is another bootloader, which is obviously not the current one, but that's pointing to the existing dual purpose native boot / virtual machine VHD that I have prepared already. It's not as you can see, it's not pointing to the demo VHD that we're creating for the purposes of this demonstration. But this is essentially the boot configuration data store, which is what all modern Windows systems are using for boot management. So when you use the BCD boot utility, what it does is it creates a BCD store in the specified location. If you don't specify an alternate location, what it does is it'll recreate the existing BCD store. And by default, it'll point to the first active partition on the disk. So in our case, it's going to be if I didn't specify anything else and I use BCD boot, it's going to work with the BCD store hosted on this partition right here. And since Server 2012 Boot Manager is using an updated boot manager, why is this? It's not showing. Oh, okay, it does show the drive letter. I thought it was I thought it looked like it didn't have a drive letter assigned, so I thought it was like an EFI type scenario. But yeah, it does have a drive letter assigned, so disregard that little freak out right there. So the first thing we need to do is we just deployed the Windows image to the L drive right here. So at this point, we're at the same point if you're familiar with the disk-based OS installation for Windows, we are now at the point where you're about to reboot, okay, the first time, and that first boot up after you go through the walkthrough of picking out your partition where you want to install the operating system, you're about to reboot. We're not about to reboot because we still have to create the system partition with the boot files, and we're about to do that. But right after that, what we need to do is we need to boot. We actually need a native boot into this OS to finalize the system partition. It's very particular. I had a lot of issues getting a dual purpose VHD to work with in both the native boot scenario and in a virtual environment as a virtual machine VHD. For Hyper-V, there's an extra step that we need to go through, but for EFI, the process is essentially going to be the same. So let's go ahead, and when we're working with BCD boot, it's unique to every operating system installation, right? So we just installed a Windows 7 image to the L drive. So what we need to do is we need to change paths over here. I'm in command prompt CLI to L Windows System 32. Okay. Now, we have BCD boot over here, and we're using the BCD boot hosted in this mounted VHD right here, which has a partition assigned with the drive letter L. So, let me switch over to L. Bam. Now if we type BCD boot, bam. Alright. You see this S switch right here, this S option? It requires a drive letter. So, like I said, for EFI, this is a bit redundant, but that's because I really want to drive this point home. For EFI, you do need to temporarily assign a drive letter for the purpose of installing the boot files. So, and the drive letter that you want, the partition where you want to install these drive files is going to be that 350 megabyte partition that we had previously assigned the S drive. Now, what we're doing is we're setting up the system partition for the VHD in a virtual environment. Now I say that because in the native boot environment, I would want to install the BCD boot. I would want to specify the E drive right here. I'm pointing to my screen as if you guys could see that. I'm sorry, I'm such a reread. So this is where we would want to specify for the S switch that I just pointed out to you guys. We would want to specify the E drive in the native boot scenario if we're working with a different operating system. So I will revisit what we need to do in a dual boot scenario. Goodness gracious, stop. So let's go ahead and stay on track here. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit ADHD. I'm sorry. So let's go ahead and run the BCD boot command to install the boot files for the Windows 7 operating system. So we're using the BCD boot from the mounted VHD, and the VHD just had the Windows 7 Ultimate operating system installed to the L drive. So that's why we are using the BCD boot hosted in that path. So the first switch tells you where the operating system files are. This is crucial because this is why BCD boot is unique to every installation. So you specify L Windows because we want to set up boot files for Windows 7. So that's why we specify L :/Windows, and then we pass it the S parameter, and then we specify S for the system partition to which we want to install it. If you don't specify that S option, I should have showed you guys what the S drive looked like before. But you can just trust that before before we just ran that BCD boot command, if I would have opened up the S drive, it would have been blank. There would have been nothing here. But now we see the boot files that we just installed. Here we see a BCD store. Now we could look at it if we specified the particular store. So we now have, at this point in time, we have 2 stores accessible from within this operating environment. So what we could do is type BCD edit, type store, and then we're going to specify Windows. Oops. Boot BCD, which is going to correspond to this file right here. We're going to enum and v. Notice how the output is different. Before, when we were looking at the current BCD store, we saw a description of Windows 7 Ultimate with the B2VHD designator. That indicated to me that it's, you know, a Boot2VHD option, or B2VHD implementation. And then that's the default right there. That's the host operating system. But we specified the BCD store that we just created, and now it shows a different description. And if you were to double check all the math and whatnot, you would see different GUIDs. Now, one thing you do need to take into consideration is the very first bootloader, I think, has the same GUID. I think if we had deployed server 2012 right here, it would have the same GUID as the host operating system up here. Do not be alarmed by that. That is to be expected. What does matter is that within a particular boot configuration data store, that the different bootloaders have different GUIDs, okay? But if you're looking between different BCD stores and you see the same GUID, I think the first GUID for this, if you're comparing the same operating system version but 2 different BCD stores, the GUID will be the same, okay? That's just my own personal note. So now, in order to finalize this and make it a system partition, what we need to do is, for a dual boot scenario, if this is your first if this is a native boot exclusive VHD, you're not using it in a dual boot scenario, at this point you could just assume, if you were preparing like a bare metal machine this way, you know, from the command line environment, you could just straight up boot into it. Now you could just restart the machine and it'll pretty much take you through the initial configuration of a brand new Windows installation, prompting you for computer name, admin name, account, password, etc., etc. That once you go through that process, it'll finalize. We'll see a system partition designation here. But in a dual boot scenario, what you do is you need to edit the BCD edit store. And what you do is you copy default, or if you want to, like I said, I gave the recommendation as a best practice to use the we want to go back to the C drive and run BCD edit enum v, just so I'm following my own wisdom. There we go. We'll copy this one. Actually, we'll copy this. Yeah, we'll copy this one. We need to make some changes. Now, this is what you'd be doing for a dual boot scenario. So BCD edit, copy, specify the GUID. Now, what this is doing is saying, I want you to use this as a template. So whatever options. So within this bootloader, you have all these different elements and values, right? So you have this description element. This is what's called a BCD object. It's a BCD bootloader object. Now it has different elements. Each one of these lines is a different element, and it carries a different, it's just options that you can configure for the bootloader. So if we look at the server 2012 option right here, this is going to be an option that you need to configure, and you'll be able to just kind of follow. You'll be able to pick up on how to do that for Hyper-V. If you do not have this option configured, then Hyper-V will not be able to start virtual machines. It's kind of weird. So if this isn't configured for your Hyper-V environment, for whatever the host operating system is, the guest or whatever you want to call, or not the guest, but the host or parent operating system, when you try to start a virtual machine in Hyper-V, if you don't have this particular option configured for the host bootloader and the host bootloader BCD object, then it's not going to work. So what it's going to do is it's going to copy this template, and we're going to assign it a description of, demo Windows. We'll put Windows 7 Ultimate Demo V2VHD. Okay. Why did that not work? Oh my goodness. Give me a second, I'm referencing my notes real quick. Why did that not work? It didn't work because I left off the quotation. Okay, maybe, I don't think I've ever done it that way, but this, goodness gracious. There we go. So it didn't work previously because there wasn't a space between that D parameter and the GUID that I had specified. So that's why it didn't work. So yeah, that should work. I gave you some legit advice. All right. So now if we type BCD edit enum, we should see the copy that we just created with this updated description here. And there we go. There we have it. I want to. I want to delete value. There we go. Alright. So I'm going to scroll back up, get the GUID for the bootloader object that we just copied and created. We need to make some modifications to both the device value, the OS device value, and then we're going to get rid of this because we're not going to be running Hyper-V in Windows 7. All right, so and hypervisor launch type. Okay, so now we can V again, and we should see the one we just created. Where's Windows 7? Demo. All right, we no longer see that hypervisor launch auto type entry or element that we copied over when we created the copy. So the next two things we need to do is we need to edit set, specify this GUID. Specify the device element, and then we need to update the, give me a second here. Yeah, we need to put VHD. Now there's a couple different ways that you could do this. I'm just going to tell you guys to put it this way. So what you can do is you can specify locate like this, and then put a backslash, and what this is going to do is it's going to search all the available partitions that are exposed to that boot manager. And so what this means is you can specify the path of the VHD, but that VHD needs to be like on the root directory of a partition. Does that make sense? Just like we have done so here, the VHD that we created, it's hosted. For example, we would put the client, we're going to put the demo in the D drive just for argument's sake. And what we'll do, and you could see that I did the same thing here. Look at this one. This is the working dual purpose VHD, bootable VHD. and VM VHD. And you can see that it's got the D drive right here, but you could substitute locate instead, and then just type the name of the VHD. And what you want to do is you want to do that for both the device element and the OS device element. And the boot manager will intelligently be able to locate the bootloader for those files or whatnot. So that bootloader will know to find the operating system files, the critical operating system files, based off of, where it finds the VHD, but it needs to be like in the root directory of a partition to which the boot manager has access. Like in this particular instance, on the D drive, you just see that it's it's on the root directory, the path of that particular partition / volume. So a volume is essentially a partition that has a file system assigned to it. One other thing that we need to do is this partition needs to get marked as active. Now you could just mark it as active right there, or you could do it in PowerShell, which I'll show you right here. A key note about active partitions is you can only have one partition active per disk. So since this is a VHD, it's treated as a separate disk or whatever. We have disk 0. You can mark it as active. But if you were, for example, to mark this partition as active, the boot manager is not going to look for boot files on any other partition other than the one that's marked as active. So if your boot files are over here on this active partition and you mark this as active, you're going to have boot issues. You're going to have to boot into a recovery environment and fix that. So I'm not actually going to go through the native boot process to finalize the system partition, but you guys would need to take the time to do that at this point in time after we mark it as active. Let's see, marking it as active. Partition. Is that here? Is active, blah 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 blah. So we would do it based off of, okay. So here we see all the partitions that are available to this operating environment. So what we would do is, this is the partition we want to mark as active. You see it's on disk number 3 and partition number 1. So set partition, disk number 3, partition number 1 is active. It requires a Boolean value, so we'll pass the parameter of true. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, at this particular point in time, this BCD edit is going to be looking for the demo VHD. So this is what's going to happen. So in order for you to be able to native boot into this, in order to finalize the system partition, this demo VHD has to be on the root level, like I said. For example, this D drive or whatnot. So make sure that the demo, like whatever your VHD is called, if you want to native boot into it, make sure it's on a volume on the root, the root path of that volume or whatnot. So I'm not going to do that because you guys wouldn't be, I can't record me booting into a native operating environment, so let me go ahead and just revert back to my client operating system, and I'm going to show you guys what needs to happen when you want to now configure the VHD for use within a virtual environment such as Hyper-V. Now, for EFI purposes, you should be good to go. Like if you follow these steps right here and created this system partition, and then you native boot into it to finalize this partition to make it, to mark it as a system partition, you should be able to load it into like VirtualBox, for example, and you should be good to go. You should be able to native boot into it and use it for a virtual machine. So just to kind of recap real quick, you want to native boot into it to finalize the system partition right here that you would create for it. And then you could specify that VHD in the creation of a virtual machine in VirtualBox, and you should be good to go. It should work at that point in time. You could disallocate or remove this drive letter, and you should be good to go for an EFI environment. But if you're using a BIOS firmware-based environment, then you would want to leave this this drive letter assigned. So that's how that would work. Now for Hyper-V, there's a couple extra steps that we need to take, which I'm about to show you right now. Okay, so let's say that you've already native booted into it. You would, in order to, we need to make a registry change. And in order to do that, you would need to remount the VHD. So I'm going to dismount the VHD just so you can see what that would look like. VHD path is, come on now. Okay, so you see that disappeared from disk management over here. That's only just to simulate. You know, you specify the path. If you're following my instructions, it should be on the root path of wherever. So like for this example, I'm going to use the one that that I already have working, but that's not going to. You'll still be able to get the full intent of the demonstration here. Client 1 VHD. And so you see there's already some drive letters assigned to it. That's no big deal. So what we want to do at this particular point in time is we need to load the registry, our registry hive from the VHD, and we need to modify the value of one of the subkeys. I'm about to show you that right now. Oh, just to recap real quick. The reason why I recommended, if you go back to the this particular link right here that I showed you, which is adding a native boot virtual hard disk to the boot menu, you're gonna come across some information like this. Oh no, excuse me. You want to go to this link right here. Now, what you'll find within that document is you'll find some very critical information. Steps 2 through 5 that I'm concerned with right here. It's these steps that are underlined, and what it says is, you know, what I pretty much just recapped with you. But you follow those steps in that particular order. And this, you see how it's saying reboot to Windows 7 to establish the new system partition? If you don't follow that particular order, and you start doing things out of that particular order without establishing the system partition, you might get it to work in either a native boot scenario, or you might get it to work in a virtual machine scenario, but not both. Okay, so that's how that would work. But if you follow these steps, the ones that are relevant to the process that we're concerned with here are steps 2 through 5. Again, that's in this link, how to create a separate system partition for dual booting. Don't mind the description. We're just concerned with this process right here, because that's what we're using to establish the system partition. So once that's done, and we've booted back into the preparation environment or what have you, and we want to use this VHD and Hyper-V, right, for a virtual machine. So what we need to do is mount the VHD. It's mounted now, and what we need to do is, give me a second, we'll pull up the file real quick. Bam, right here. Oh, excuse me. And that link is right here, the one that I'm about to show you the information that is relevant. So this is, if you click on that link, it's gonna run you through these same steps right here. So what's gonna happen, I'm gonna take this back off screen, and I'm just gonna follow along with me on screen here. So with that mounted, what we need to do is pull up regedit, right? What we're gonna do is we're gonna load a registry hive. Now, in order to load a registry hive, you have to go to either HK, current user, or local machine. Then, with one of those selected, it's called a root key. With one of those root keys selected, you could load hive. Now, we're concerned with a sub key that's going to be located under the HKLM. So that's why I went ahead You might be able to get it to work another way, but I'm pretty much just replicating the same process. So of the same value, what we're concerned with working with, right? So load a hive, and what we're going to do is we're going to navigate to the mounted VHD, the partition that's there, and it's going to the registry is going to be located under Windows System 32, and then from there, where is System? Oh, excuse me. You go to System 32, then you go to Config, and then it should be right here. We'll specify that. We need to assign a temporary, this is basically like setting up a temporary mount point. So I just put temp, B2VHD hive. We'll call it client 1. But if we were following the same suit, we would just call it the demo hive, right? That's what I would do. So now what we have is the registry file loaded for the from the VHD. We're going to navigate to current control set 1. Oh no, excuse me. We're going to go to System. Alright, just follow this one. Don't go to System. I had some bad notes right there, which I just discovered. I'm sorry. So go to HKLM from that temporary mount point that we just used for that registry hive. Then we're going to go to services, and now what we're looking for here is you can just start typing Intel IDE. Now, I already modified this value right here. Startup, by default, it's going to have a value assigned of 3. So if we, by default, this would be carrying this value right now. Now, in order to be able to dual purpose use this as both the native boot VHD and a Hyper-V VM VHD, you have to change that value to a 0. Once you do that, you can then dismount the VHD. Then you could launch Hyper-V. I've already done this, but you would essentially go through the process of creating a new virtual machine. And then for VHD1, you would want to specify, obviously, for just the VHD, you've got to specify generation 1. If you're working with VHDX, you could then specify generation 2. And that would be, on an as-needed basis if you require some additional, like a Gen 2 will provide like a Pixie boot environment, etc., etc. So at this point, we would specify the name. You just go through the same thing, but when you connect the virtual hard disk, you would use an existing one. You would, you would specify the path that's hosting, the VHD that you want to specify or that you want to use. And then you just finalize the installation. And then when you boot into it, you should be at the screen right after the, I'm going to refer back to when you native booted into it to finalize the system partition. You should be at like the very first, the screen like where you haven't configured anything yet. So after you pick out the computer name and whatnot, when you finalize a Windows operating system installation, you boot into the operating system environment where you see the start screen or whatnot, everything you're familiar with for whatever the relevant Windows operating system is. So at this point, if you boot into it, you should get a working Hyper-V VM. So that's that little registry thing is something that you need to do in order to get it to work with as both a native boot VHD and a virtual machine VHD. And that's a word jumble. Plus it's super late. It's like 10 at night. I'm sorry. So that's pretty much it, boys and girls. Goodness gracious. I'll figure this out later. But if you followed my instructions, it should work. I'm not sure if things kind of got jacked up just off of what I was showing you, but If you follow my instructions to the T, I'm just going to restore everything back to the way it was, following the instructions that I gave you guys. Or actually, you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and fix this. So, why is this not working? What I'm gonna do is remount that. Let's mount that VHD again. If you guys just want to see how you might troubleshoot that. So I got it mounted, right? So now I'm gonna jump back over. Let me clear screen here. Store. Oh no, what is the store? J. Oh, see? It seems to have lost its system partition. That's weird. I wonder if I need to boot into it, if that'll fix it. Actually, disregard that. This is the system partition as far as the operating environment is concerned. If I booted into it as a virtual machine, then this partition, this whole disk, this VHD, this disk structure would load into the VM, and then this would then reflect the system designation. So J Boot2VHD. Okay, so let's see, what are we looking at here? It's looking for the client in the right place. That's the boot manager. Yep. Oh, I didn't dismount the registry. I wonder if that corrupted it. Ooh. Yeah, unload hive. Actually, let's run through that again. Okay, so that's good to go. All right. Boot manager. Be good. That partition. Okay. Yeah, that should be good to go. Boot files are there. This was working. Bitch. I forget to unmount it again. Alright. You know what, boys and girls? I'm gonna go ahead and chop it off right there. I'm basically just gonna double check everything and make sure everything's configured the way that I just demonstrated to you guys, and it should work. I already had it in a working configuration. So yeah, you can just trust that I'm not lying to you. I'm sorry that I couldn't demonstrate that, but I don't want to waste your time because it might take me some time. Plus, my brain's a little fried right now, so who knows how long it's gonna take me to identify the issue. But like I said, if you follow those links and whatnot, you should be able to get it to work. Sorry I couldn't troubleshoot it effectively given the time. I might post a follow-up video just to prove that it did work. So stay tuned for that if you're interested in making sure I know what I'm talking about. All right, cheers.